The morning sun filtered through the ornate windows of courtroom 347, casting long shadows across the polished wooden benches. A young attorney smoothed her charcoal gray suit and adjusted her briefcase, preparing for what should have been a routine preliminary hearing. She had handled hundreds of these cases before, but something felt different today. At 34, she had already earned a reputation as one of the Department of Justice's rising stars. Her colleagues knew her as a brilliant legal mind who had successfully prosecuted some of the most complex white-collar crime cases in the state. Today, however, she wasn't at the federal courthouse where she usually practiced. Instead, she found herself in the state courthouse, filling in for a colleague who had fallen ill. The courtroom buzzed with the usual morning activity, clerks shuffling papers, attorneys huddling with their clients, and the bailiff preparing for the day's proceedings. As she organized her files, she couldn't help but notice the curious glances from other attorneys. She was used to being one of the few women of color in these spaces, but something about these looks felt different, almost dismissive. Judge Richard Henderson swept into the courtroom, his black robes billowing behind him. The bailiff's voice rang out, "All rise." The atmosphere shifted immediately as everyone scrambled to their feet. The judge settled into his high-backed leather chair, peering down at the assembly through wire-rimmed glasses. "Good morning, everyone," he announced, his voice carrying a hint of impatience. "Let's keep things moving today. We have a full docket." His eyes scanned the room, pausing briefly on the federal prosecutor before moving on with what seemed like barely concealed disdain. As cases were called one by one, she observed Judge Henderson's demeanor. He was cordial with most attorneys, particularly the older men in expensive suits. However, when he addressed younger attorneys or those from diverse backgrounds, his tone carried a subtle edge that made her increasingly uncomfortable. Finally, her case was called. The State v. Reynolds Corporation, case number 2025, CR 789, the clerk announced. She rose confidently, straightening her suit jacket. "Your Honor, I represent the United States government in this matter." Before she could continue, Judge Henderson cut her off. "Young lady, are you sure you're in the right courtroom? This is a complex financial crimes case." His tone was patronizing, drawing a few snickers from the gallery. She maintained her composure, though her heart raced. "Yes, Your Honor. I'm the lead prosecutor assigned to this case." She reached for her credentials, but the judge waved his hand dismissively. "I've been handling these cases longer than you've probably been alive," he continued, his voice dripping with condescension. "Perhaps you'd be more comfortable starting with something simpler, traffic court, perhaps?" The courtroom fell silent. Other attorneys shifted uncomfortably in their seats. She took a deep breath, remembering her mentor's words about maintaining dignity in the face of prejudice. "Your Honor, I appreciate your concern. However, I've successfully prosecuted over 50 similar cases in federal court. I'm well prepared to present today's matter." Judge Henderson's face reddened slightly. "Well, then, enlighten us about the complexities of the RICO statute as it applies to this case. Since you're so experienced." His sarcasm was palpable. What happened next would later become legendary in legal circles. With precise detail and unwavering confidence, she began explaining the intricate legal framework, citing recent precedents and specific sections of the law that even seasoned attorneys rarely referenced. The judge's expression gradually shifted from dismissive to surprised as she demonstrated her extensive knowledge. Mid-explanation, the courtroom doors opened quietly. A distinguished-looking man in a perfectly tailored suit entered, taking a seat in the back row. Several attorneys recognized him immediately, the United States Attorney for their district, her direct superior. The young prosecutor continued her presentation, unaware of her boss's presence. She outlined the government's case against Reynolds Corporation, methodically laying out evidence of financial fraud that had cost hundreds of people their life savings. Judge Henderson attempted to interrupt several times with increasingly technical questions, clearly trying to trip her up. Each time, she responded with even more detailed legal analysis, her answers revealing years of specialized experience in complex financial litigation. The judge's frustration became increasingly evident. "Your citations are probably outdated," he snapped. "The law has evolved since your textbook days." "Actually, Your Honor," she replied calmly, "I'm referring to the Robinson decision from the Supreme Court, released just last month. I had the privilege of working on that case personally." At this point, the U.S. Attorney stood up from his seat in the back. "Your Honor," his deep voice resonated through the courtroom, "I hope you're treating my Deputy Chief of Financial Crimes with the respect her position deserves." The color drained from Judge Henderson's face as he finally recognized her name and position. The young attorney he had been belittling was not only a federal prosecutor but one of the most respected financial crimes prosecutors in the country. She had argued before the Supreme Court twice, and her work had helped shape modern financial crime prosecution. The whispers in the courtroom grew louder as attorneys realized what they had just witnessed. Judge Henderson cleared his throat, suddenly finding great interest in the papers before him. "Well," he stammered, "it seems we've gotten off track. Please proceed with your motion, Counselor." She simply nodded, maintaining her professional demeanor despite the satisfaction she felt. "Thank you, Your Honor." Returning to the matter at hand, she continued presenting her case as if the previous exchange had never happened, demonstrating the grace and professionalism that had earned her such a prestigious position at a young age. As she concluded her presentation, even Judge Henderson couldn't find fault with her arguments. He granted the government's motion, though his earlier arrogance had been replaced with visible discomfort. After the hearing, junior attorneys crowded around her, eager to introduce themselves and express their admiration for how she handled the situation. The U.S. Attorney approached with a proud smile, having witnessed firsthand why she was considered one of the department's most promising stars. That evening, as she packed up her briefcase, she reflected on the day's events. The incident would have crushed her confidence early in her career, but now it only strengthened her resolve. She thought about all the young attorneys who would face similar prejudices and hoped her example would inspire them to persist, to excel, and to change the system from within. Little did she know, this was just the beginning of a series of encounters that would not only challenge her professional resilience but also lead to unexpected changes in the local judicial system. As she walked out of the courthouse into the setting sun, she couldn't help but smile, knowing that sometimes the best response to prejudice is simply to be excellent at what you do. News of the courthouse confrontation spread like wildfire through the legal community. By the next morning, the young federal prosecutor's inbox was flooded with messages from colleagues, law students, and even judges from other districts. Many shared similar experiences, while others expressed their support and admiration for her composure under pressure. She tried to focus on her ongoing cases, but the incident had sparked something larger than herself. Local news outlets began requesting interviews, which she politely declined. Her role wasn't to seek publicity but to serve justice. However, she couldn't ignore the broader implications of what had transpired. A week after the incident, she received an unexpected visit from the State Bar Association's Ethics Committee chairperson. "We've received multiple reports about Judge Henderson's behavior," the chairperson explained, settling into a chair in her federal courthouse office. "Apparently, your experience wasn't an isolated incident." The prosecutor listened intently as the chairperson shared other complaints that had surfaced since her encounter. Young attorneys, particularly women and minorities, had faced similar treatment but had been too intimidated to speak up. Judge Henderson's behavior had created an atmosphere of fear and discrimination in his courtroom, affecting the quality of legal representation clients received. "We need your help," the chairperson concluded. "Would you be willing to provide a formal statement about your experience?" She sat back in her chair, considering the request carefully. Making a formal complaint against a judge wasn't a decision to be taken lightly. It could have implications for her career, despite her position. Yet, She thought about all the young attorneys who didn't have the protection of her federal credentials. "I'll do it," she decided. "But I want to be clear, this isn't about personal vindication. It's about ensuring equal access to justice." The following weeks proved challenging. While many supported her decision, others in the legal community viewed her actions as controversial. Some older attorneys argued she was disrupting the traditional hierarchy of the courts. Anonymous comments appeared on legal blogs, suggesting she was playing the race card or too sensitive. One morning, she arrived at her office to find a hand-delivered letter from Judge Henderson himself. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it, unsure whether to expect an apology or more hostility. The letter was brief but surprising. "I request a meeting to discuss recent events. No attorneys present, just a conversation between colleagues." Her initial instinct was to decline. However, after consulting with her mentor, she decided to accept, choosing a public coffee shop as the meeting location. As she walked into the cafe 3 days later, she spotted Judge Henderson already seated in a corner booth, looking significantly less imposing without his judicial robes. "Thank you for coming," he began, his voice lacking its usual authority. "I've done a lot of thinking since our courtroom encounter." He paused, struggling with his next words. "My generation of judges, we came up in a different era. But that's not an excuse." She listened silently as he continued, describing his journey from a working-class background to the bench, and how he'd prided himself on being tough but fair. Recent events had forced him to confront the possibility that his version of fairness had been clouded by unconscious biases. "I'm not here to excuse my behavior," he said finally. "I'm here because you've made me realize I need to do better. The law evolves, and so must its practitioners." The conversation lasted over 2 hours. They discussed the changing face of the legal profession, the importance of mentorship, and the responsibility of experienced judges to encourage rather than intimidate the next generation of legal talent. As they prepared to leave, Judge Henderson made an unexpected proposal. "I'd like to establish a mentorship program for young attorneys in our district," he said. "Would you consider being an advisor? Your perspective would be invaluable." The request caught her off guard. It represented an opportunity to create systemic change, but she needed to ensure it wasn't just a publicity stunt. "I'll consider it," she replied carefully, "if the program includes concrete measures for addressing bias and promoting diversity in the legal profession." In the following days, as she reflected on the meeting, news broke that changed everything. A local civil rights organization had conducted a comprehensive study of Judge Henderson's past rulings, revealing a pattern of disparate treatment based on attorneys' gender and race. The findings made headlines, and suddenly, her personal experience became part of a larger narrative about systemic bias in the judicial system. The state Supreme Court took notice, launching a formal investigation into judicial conduct across the district. What had begun as a single confrontation was now catalyzing institutional change. Judge Henderson's proposed mentorship program would become just one part of a broader reform initiative. As she sat in her office reviewing case files one evening, her phone buzzed with a message. A young law student had written to thank her for speaking up, sharing how the story had given her the courage to continue pursuing her dream of becoming a prosecutor despite facing similar prejudices. The message reminded her of her own early days in law school, when she desperately needed role models who looked like her. Now, she had become that role model for others. The responsibility weighed heavily, but it also gave her renewed purpose. The next morning, she would return to court, facing a different judge in a different case. But something had fundamentally changed. Her stand against injustice hadn't just been about one judge or one incident, it had become a catalyst for examining the subtle biases that often went unchallenged in the legal system. As she prepared for her next case, she realized that true change doesn't always come from dramatic confrontations. Sometimes, it comes from having the courage to stand firm in your expertise and dignity, creating ripples that inspire others to speak up and demand better. The legal profession was slowly transforming, and she was proud to be part of that change, one case at a time. The state Supreme Court's investigation into judicial conduct sent shockwaves through the legal community. As spring turned to summer, the young federal prosecutor found herself at the center of a movement she hadn't intended to start. Her phone rang constantly with requests for interviews and speaking engagements, but she remained focused on her primary mission: justice for the victims of financial crimes. One muggy morning, she arrived at her office to find an unexpected visitor, the daughter of one of Judge Henderson's past defendants. The woman, a small business owner, clutched a thick folder of court documents. "I've been following your story," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "5 years ago, my father lost his business in Judge Henderson's court. We always felt the ruling was unfair, but we didn't know how to fight it." As the prosecutor reviewed the documents, a disturbing pattern emerged. The case had striking similarities to others where Judge Henderson had shown bias. The defendant, a successful minority business owner, had faced unusually harsh treatment during proceedings, and the final judgment seemed disproportionate to the alleged violation. The discovery placed her in a difficult position. While she couldn't directly intervene in past state court cases, she couldn't ignore potential miscarriages of justice either. After careful consideration, she connected the business owner with a civil rights attorney who specialized in judicial review. Meanwhile, the State Bar Association's Ethics Committee had expanded its investigation. More stories emerged, not just about Judge Henderson, but about systemic issues throughout the state court system. Young attorneys began organizing informal support groups, sharing experiences and strategies for dealing with biased treatment. The prosecutor's office became an unofficial hub for these discussions. During lunch breaks, junior attorneys would gather in the conference room, sharing stories and seeking advice. She observed these meetings quietly, proud to see the next generation of legal professionals finding their voice. One afternoon, she received an unexpected call from the state Supreme Court Chief Justice's office. The Chief Justice wanted to meet with her personally to discuss the ongoing investigation and potential reforms. As she drove to the state capitol the following week, she reflected on how far things had come from that initial courtroom confrontation. The Chief Justice's office was impressive but welcoming, with walls lined with legal texts and historical photographs. The Chief Justice, a veteran of countless legal battles herself, got straight to the point. "We're considering implementing mandatory bias training for all state court judges," she explained. "But we need someone who understands both the federal and state systems to help design the program. Someone who can speak from experience." The prosecutor listened carefully as the Chief Justice outlined the proposed reforms. They went beyond simple sensitivity training, including structural changes to how judges were evaluated and held accountable. It was an ambitious plan that could fundamentally change the state's legal landscape. "Why me?" she asked finally. "There are more experienced attorneys who could lead this." The Chief Justice smiled. "Because you did something rare, you stood your ground without burning bridges. You turned a confrontation into an opportunity for change. That's exactly the approach we need." As she left the Capitol building, her phone buzzed with a news alert. The civil rights attorney she'd recommended was filing a class action lawsuit on behalf of multiple defendants who claimed they'd received unfair treatment in Judge Henderson's court. The story was gaining national attention. That evening, she received another unexpected call, this time from Judge Henderson himself. His voice sounded tired, resigned. "I've decided to take early retirement," he announced. "But before I go, I want to make things right." He explained that he'd been reviewing his past cases, particularly those involving minority defendants. He'd found patterns in his own decisions that he couldn't justify. "I'm requesting that the state Supreme Court review all my major rulings from the past 5 years," he said. "It's the right thing to do." The news of Judge Henderson's retirement and request for review made headlines across the state. Legal blogs buzzed with speculation about the implications for other judges with similar patterns of bias. The prosecutor found herself quoted in several articles, though she hadn't given any interviews. In the midst of all this, she still had her regular caseload to manage. The Reynolds Corporation case that had started everything was moving forward, and she was determined not to let the ongoing controversy affect her work. If anything, the recent events had made her even more committed to ensuring equal justice under the law. One morning, as she prepared for a crucial hearing in the Reynolds case, she found a letter slipped under her office door. It was from a group of first-year law students at the state university. They'd created a new organization dedicated to promoting diversity in the legal profession and fighting systemic bias. They wanted her to be their first honorary member. Reading their earnest words, she felt a mix of emotions. The students wrote about how her story had inspired them to believe they could succeed in law despite the obstacles they might face. They saw hope in how one person's stand for dignity could spark institutional change. As she drafted her response to the students, she thought about the ripple effects of that day in Judge Henderson's courtroom. What had begun as a personal confrontation had evolved into something much larger, a movement for reform that touched every level of the state's legal system. The next day, she would return to federal court, where the Reynolds Corporation case awaited. But now she carried with her the knowledge that her actions had helped open doors for others. The legal profession was slowly changing, becoming more inclusive and equitable, one small victory at a time. That evening, as she reviewed case files in her office, she paused to look at a photo on her desk, herself as a fresh law school graduate, full of hopes and determination. She wished she could tell that younger version of herself that standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult, could create changes beyond anything she could imagine. The sun was setting over the city skyline, casting long shadows through her office window. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new battles for justice. But for now, she allowed herself a moment to appreciate how far they'd come, and to dream about how much further they could go. As autumn painted the courthouse trees in brilliant shades of gold and red, the young federal prosecutor found herself facing an unexpected challenge. The Reynolds Corporation case had taken a complicated turn, revealing connections to several high-profile judges across the state. Some of these judges had served alongside Henderson and shared similar patterns of biased rulings. During a crucial meeting with her investigative team, an FBI agent presented evidence suggesting a troubling network of influence within the state's judicial system. It's not just about individual bias anymore, the agent explained, spreading photographs and documents across the conference table. We're seeing systematic efforts to protect certain interests while disadvantaging others. The revelation hit hard. What had started as a confrontation with one judge was unveiling a deeper, more entrenched problem. The prosecutor spent late nights in her office, connecting dots between cases, judges, and rulings that spanned decades. The pattern was subtle but undeniable. One evening, as she pored over case files, her office phone rang. The caller was a retired court clerk who had worked in the state courthouse for 30 years. "I've been watching what you're doing," the clerk said, her voice carrying the weight of years of silent observation. "There's something you need to see." The next morning, they met at a small diner on the outskirts of town. The clerk brought a weathered notebook filled with meticulous notes spanning her entire career. She had documented countless instances of judicial misconduct, biased rulings, and suspicious patterns in case assignments. "I always knew something wasn't right," the clerk explained, her hands trembling slightly as she pointed to specific entries. But who would listen to a clerk? We were supposed to keep our heads down and do our jobs. The notebook was a goldmine of information, providing context and connections that would have taken months to uncover otherwise. But it also presented a dilemma. Using this information meant exposing dozens of people who had been complicit through their silence, including many who had simply been trying to protect their livelihoods. Back in her office, the prosecutor faced a difficult decision. The scope of the investigation had grown far beyond what anyone had anticipated. It wasn't just about Judge Henderson anymore, or even about bias. It was about a systemic failure to uphold justice. She decided to brief her superior, the U.S. Attorney, about the new developments. His office was quiet as she laid out the evidence, explaining the broader implications. When she finished, he sat in silence for a long moment. "You understand what you're suggesting?" he asked finally. "This could shake the entire state judicial system to its core. Are you prepared for the backlash?" She thought about the young law students who had written to her, about the retired clerk's decades of silent witness, about all the people who had faced injustice in courtrooms that were supposed to protect their rights. "If we don't address this now," she replied, "when will we?" The U.S. Attorney nodded slowly. "Proceed carefully," he advised. "But you have my full support." The investigation expanded, now involving multiple federal agencies. The prosecutor coordinated with civil rights organizations, providing them with information that could help identify cases requiring review. The work was exhausting but necessary. One morning, she arrived at her office to find an anonymous note on her desk. "Back off while you still can," it read. "Some things are bigger than you." The threat was clear, but it only strengthened her resolve. She had come too far to be intimidated now. The local media began picking up on the broader investigation. Headlines shifted from focusing on Judge Henderson to examining the entire system. Legal experts appeared on news programs, discussing the implications of systematic bias in the courts. The story was gaining national attention. In the midst of this growing storm, she received an unexpected invitation. A prestigious law school wanted her to give a guest lecture about ethics in the legal system. Initially, she planned to decline, there was too much work to be done. But her mentor convinced her that sharing her experience could inspire the next generation of legal professionals. The lecture hall was packed when she arrived. Students, faculty, and practicing attorneys filled every seat, with more standing along the walls. As she began speaking, she noticed Judge Henderson's daughter sitting in the back row, taking notes. She spoke not just about her confrontation with Judge Henderson, but about the larger issues it had exposed. She talked about the responsibility of legal professionals to challenge injustice, even when it appeared in subtle forms. The room was silent except for the sound of pens scratching on paper and the occasional murmur of agreement. After the lecture, Judge Henderson's daughter approached her. "I wanted to thank you," she said quietly. "What you've done, it's helped me understand my father better. And why change is so necessary." That evening, returning to her office, she found another batch of case files waiting for review. The Reynolds Corporation case had evolved into something much larger, touching every corner of the state's legal system. But now, she wasn't working alone. Other prosecutors, attorneys, and investigators had joined the effort, each bringing their own expertise and determination. As she settled in for another long night of work, she noticed a small package on her desk. Inside was a framed quote from Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall: "In recognizing the humanity of our fellow beings, we pay ourselves the highest tribute." The note attached was from the retired court clerk: "Thank you for hearing what we couldn't say. Thank you for fighting what we couldn't fight." Looking out her office window at the city lights below, she reflected on how far they had come. The path ahead was still challenging, but something fundamental had shifted. The wall of silence was crumbling, and in its place, a new generation of legal professionals was rising, determined to build a more just system. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new revelations, and undoubtedly new attempts to maintain the status quo. But for now, she allowed herself to feel hopeful. Change was coming, not through dramatic gestures or grand speeches, but through the quiet determination of people who believed in justice. The night deepened outside her window as she turned back to her work. There were still many stories to uncover, many wrongs to right. But she wasn't alone anymore. A movement had begun, and there was no turning back. The investigation into systemic judicial bias had grown beyond anyone's expectations, touching every corner of the state's legal system. As winter settled over the city, the young federal prosecutor found herself at the center of a gathering storm. The Reynolds Corporation case, which had started it all, was now just one thread in a complex web of corruption and prejudice. Early one morning, she received an urgent call from her investigative team. They had discovered a series of encrypted emails between several state judges, revealing coordinated efforts to steer certain cases toward specific outcomes. The implications were staggering. "We're not just looking at bias anymore," her lead investigator explained during an emergency meeting. "This is organized corruption. They've been manipulating case assignments for years, ensuring certain types of defendants always appeared before specific judges." The evidence was compelling. Spreadsheets tracked case outcomes based on defendants' backgrounds. Notes discussed which judges could be trusted with sensitive cases. The system wasn't just broken, it had been deliberately rigged. As she drove home that evening, a black SUV pulled up alongside her car at a stoplight. The window rolled down, revealing a familiar face, a prominent defense attorney who represented many of the city's wealthy clients. "You're making powerful people very nervous," he said, his voice casual but his eyes cold. "Maybe it's time to consider your future. There's always room for talented prosecutors in private practice." She kept her expression neutral, but her hands tightened on the steering wheel. "I appreciate the career advice," she replied evenly, "but I'm exactly where I need to be." The next morning, she arrived at her office to find her team in an uproar. Someone had leaked details of the investigation to the press. Headlines screamed about judicial corruption, and news vans were already gathering outside the courthouse. Her phone buzzed with a message from the U.S. Attorney, "My office. Now." When she entered his office, she found not just her boss but also representatives from the Department of Justice's Public Integrity section. The atmosphere was tense. "This just became a national priority," the U.S. Attorney announced. "We're forming a joint task force. The question is, are you ready to lead it?" She looked at the faces around the room, understanding the weight of the moment. This wasn't just about one state anymore. Their investigation could set a precedent for judicial reform across the country. "Before you answer," one of the DOJ representatives added, "you should know that we've received credible threats. This goes deeper than we initially thought. Some very powerful people want this investigation shut down." She thought about the anonymous note on her desk, the attempted bribe from the defense attorney, the years of systematic injustice documented in the clerk's notebook. "When do we start?" she asked. The task force began its work immediately, setting up operations in a secure floor of the federal building. Teams of investigators, analysts, and prosecutors worked around the clock, connecting dots and building cases. The evidence they uncovered was damning. One afternoon, as she reviewed surveillance photos, a young intern rushed into her office. "You need to see this," he said, handing her a tablet. On the screen was a breaking news alert: one of the judges implicated in their investigation had been found unresponsive in his chambers. The judge survived, but the incident sent shockwaves through the legal community. Initial reports suggested a suicide attempt, prompted by the fear of impending indictments. The human cost of corruption was becoming painfully clear. That evening, she received an unexpected visitor, the judge's wife. The woman was elegant but visibly shaken. "I found these in his home office," she said, placing a USB drive on the desk. "I can't pretend anymore. Too many people have been hurt." The drive contained years of records, detailed notes about payoffs, connections between judges and private interests, and lists of cases where outcomes had been predetermined. It was the smoking gun they needed. As she worked late into the night reviewing the new evidence, her office phone rang. It was the retired court clerk who had provided the notebook. "They're destroying records," the clerk said urgently. "I still have friends in the courthouse. It's happening tonight. She immediately activated the task force. Within hours, federal agents were at multiple courthouses across the state, securing documents and digital records. The attempted cover-up would only add to the growing list of charges. The next morning, the headlines were unavoidable. Photos of federal agents carrying boxes from courthouses appeared on every news channel. The state's Chief Justice called an emergency meeting of the Judicial Council. In her office, she pinned a new set of photos to her investigation board. Faces of judges, lawyers, and court officials connected by red strings, each string representing a link in the chain of corruption. But she also added another section, photos of the people who had come forward, who had risked everything to expose the truth. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. It was one of her original team members, holding a stack of letters. "These just came in," he said. "From people whose cases were handled by the compromised judges. They're asking for reviews." Reading through the letters, she felt the weight of responsibility more than ever. Each page told a story of justice denied, of lives altered by biased rulings. These weren't just case numbers, they were people who had placed their trust in a system that failed them. As the day drew to a close, she received a call from her mentor, the seasoned prosecutor who had guided her early career. "I'm proud of you," he said simply. "But remember, the hardest part isn't exposing corruption. It's rebuilding trust in the system afterward." Looking out at the city lights, she understood what he meant. Exposing the corruption was just the beginning. The real challenge would be creating lasting change, ensuring that the next generation of legal professionals would inherit a system worthy of their ideals. Her computer chimed with a new email. The Department of Justice had approved additional resources for the task force. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new revelations, and undoubtedly new attempts to obstruct their investigation. But tonight, she allowed herself to feel a glimmer of hope. The wall behind her desk now held a simple framed quote, "Justice is not just about punishing the wrong, but about restoring faith in what's right." The words seemed to take on new meaning with each passing day of the investigation. She gathered her things, preparing to head home for a few hours of rest before another demanding day. The task force would reconvene at dawn, ready to continue their work of unraveling decades of systemic corruption. The path ahead was challenging, but the stakes were too high to turn back now. Spring arrived with a sense of mounting tension in the legal community. The Joint Task Force's investigation had uncovered a network of corruption that stretched back decades, and the first wave of indictments was imminent. The young federal prosecutor stood at her office window, watching dawn break over the city, knowing that today would change the state's judicial system forever. Her phone buzzed with a text from the U.S. Attorney, "Turn on the news." On every channel, breaking news banners announced that 3 senior judges had turned themselves in to federal authorities. More surrenders were expected throughout the day. The task force headquarters hummed with activity. Teams of agents and prosecutors coordinated arrests across the state, while others prepared for the inevitable legal battles ahead. The evidence they had gathered was overwhelming: thousands of documents, emails, financial records, and testimony from dozens of whistleblowers. A familiar face appeared in her office doorway, the court clerk's daughter, now a key witness in their investigation. "They're calling it the largest judicial corruption scandal in state history," she said, placing a newspaper on the desk. "My mother would have been proud to see this day." The retired clerk had passed away 2 months earlier, but her detailed records had proved invaluable to the investigation. Her notebook had become known as the conscience of the court, documenting years of systematic discrimination and corruption. As the morning progressed, more news broke. A group of prominent defense attorneys had also surrendered to authorities, accused of acting as intermediaries in the corrupt system. Among them was the lawyer who had tried to bribe her that night in traffic. Her team had uncovered evidence of a sophisticated operation. Cases were steered to specific judges through a coded system of case assignments. Defendants from certain backgrounds were consistently placed before judges known for harsh sentences, while wealthy defendants found their cases before more lenient courts. Mid-morning, she received an unexpected call from Judge Henderson, who had been cooperating with the investigation since his retirement. "I never imagined it went this deep," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "I was part of the problem, but I want to be part of the solution." She agreed to meet him for lunch at a quiet restaurant away from the media frenzy. The former judge looked older than she remembered, the weight of his actions evident in his face. "I've been reviewing every case I handled," he explained, spreading files across the table. "I've identified over 200 that need immediate review. But it's not just about the cases, it's about the lives affected, the faith in justice that we betrayed." Their conversation was interrupted by urgent messages. The state's Chief Justice had called an emergency press conference. They watched on Henderson's tablet as the Chief Justice announced sweeping reforms, mandatory bias training, transparent case assignment systems, and an independent review board for judicial conduct. Back at task force headquarters, new challenges emerged. Some of the indicted judges were fighting back, hiring high-powered defense teams and claiming political persecution. Others were offering to cooperate, hoping for leniency in exchange for information about their colleagues. Late afternoon brought another breakthrough. An anonymous source provided evidence linking several state legislators to the corruption scheme. The politicians had helped block reform efforts while receiving kickbacks from interested parties. As she reviewed the new evidence with her team, a young prosecutor who had recently joined the task force spoke up. "This is why I went to law school," she said, her voice filled with determination. "To fight for real justice, not just the appearance of it." The comment reminded her of her own journey, from that first confrontation in Judge Henderson's courtroom to leading this historic investigation. The path had been challenging, but each step had been necessary. Evening brought news of more surrenders and cooperation agreements. The wall of silence that had protected the corrupt system for so long was crumbling. Judges, lawyers, and court officials were coming forward, eager to tell their stories before others beat them to it. In her office, she updated the investigation board. The red strings connecting the conspirators now formed a complex web, but there was also a new section, green strings showing the growing network of reformers and whistleblowers who were helping to rebuild the system. A message arrived from the Department of Justice. They wanted to use her state's investigation as a model for similar probes across the country. The implications were enormous. What had started as one prosecutor's stand against bias could lead to nationwide judicial reform. As night fell, she received a call from an unexpected source, the daughter of one of the indicted judges. "I found my father's private journals," the woman said, her voice trembling. "He knew what he was doing was wrong, but he convinced himself it was just how things worked. I can't stay silent anymore." The journals provided insights into how the corrupt system had perpetuated itself. Younger judges were gradually drawn in, taught to see bias and corruption as normal parts of the legal process. The system didn't just break the law, it broke the people within it. Working late into the night, she drafted a proposal for systematic reform. It wasn't enough to remove corrupt officials, they needed to change the culture that had allowed corruption to flourish. The proposal included mentorship programs, transparency requirements, and regular audits of judicial decisions. Her computer chimed with an email from a national civil rights organization. They had analyzed the data from her investigation and found clear patterns of systematic discrimination. The evidence would support reform efforts far beyond her state's borders. As midnight approached, she took a moment to read some of the letters that continued to pour in from people affected by the corrupt system. Each story reinforced the importance of their work: families separated by unfair rulings, businesses destroyed by biased decisions, lives altered by prejudiced judgments. A text message appeared from her mentor: "Remember when you thought one person couldn't change the system? Look what you started." Looking at the city lights below, she reflected on how far they had come. The investigation had revealed ugly truths about the justice system, but it had also shown the courage of those who fought to make it better. Tomorrow would bring more arrests, more revelations, and more challenges. But tonight, she could see the outline of a better system emerging from the ashes of corruption. Real change was happening, not through grand gestures, but through the determined efforts of people who believed in justice. She gathered her files, preparing to head home for a few hours of rest. The task force would reconvene at dawn, ready to continue their work. The path ahead was still challenging, but they were no longer walking it alone. A movement for true justice had begun, and there was no turning back. The morning headlines screamed across every news outlet, "Historic Judicial Reform Bill Passes State Legislature." It had been exactly 1 year since that first confrontation in Judge Henderson's courtroom, and the changes sparked by that moment were reshaping the entire legal system. The young federal prosecutor sat in her office, surrounded by stacks of case files marked for review. The task force's work had led to 47 indictments, including 15 judges, 23 attorneys, and 9 court officials. But the real impact went far beyond the numbers. Her phone lit up with a message from an unknown number: "Check your email. You need to see this." The sender was a former law clerk who had worked for one of the indicted judges. The email contained footage from courthouse security cameras, years of recordings showing how certain cases were deliberately mishandled. "I've been holding on to these for years," the clerk wrote. "I was too scared to come forward before. But after seeing what you've accomplished, I can't stay silent anymore." The footage provided visual confirmation of what their investigation had uncovered: the subtle signals between judges and attorneys, the deliberate misplacement of files, the systematic discrimination that had become routine. It was both heartbreaking and validating. Mid-morning brought an unexpected visitor, a community leader whose organization had been fighting for judicial reform for decades. "We've been shouting into the void for years," she said, settling into a chair. "Nobody wanted to believe that the system could be this broken. You didn't just expose corruption, you proved we weren't crazy." Their conversation was interrupted by urgent news. One of the indicted judges had agreed to provide testimony about corruption in federal courts. The investigation was about to cross jurisdictional lines, potentially exposing similar patterns at higher levels. The U.S. Attorney called an emergency meeting of the task force. "This is delicate territory," he warned. "Federal judges have lifetime appointments. The political implications are enormous." She looked around the room at her team, seeing the same determination in their eyes that had driven their state-level investigation. "The principles don't change," she responded. "Justice has to be blind, or it isn't justice at all." The afternoon brought another significant development. The State Bar Association announced the creation of a special committee to review thousands of cases handled by the implicated judges. They needed her help to develop criteria for identifying potentially compromised verdicts. Working with a team of legal experts, she began creating a framework for case review. They looked for patterns, disparities in sentencing, unusual plea arrangements, cases where key evidence was surprisingly excluded. Each file represented someone whose life had been affected by corruption. A knock at her door revealed Judge Henderson's successor, the newly appointed judge who had taken over his court. "I need your advice," she said, looking both determined and uncertain. "How do we rebuild trust? Every time I make a ruling now, I see people wondering if it's truly fair." The question struck at the heart of their challenge. Exposing corruption was crucial, but rebuilding faith in the system would take time and consistent effort. They discussed ideas for increasing transparency, involving community oversight, and creating clear accountability measures. Late afternoon brought news that sent shockwaves through the legal community. A group of law students had used artificial intelligence to analyze 20 years of court records, revealing statistical patterns of bias that extended far beyond their state. Their findings suggested similar corruption networks might exist nationwide. The students' research provided powerful support for their investigation's findings. Using data analysis, they had mapped out how certain types of cases consistently receive different treatment based on defendants' backgrounds. The evidence was impossible to ignore. As evening approached, she received a call from the state's new Chief Justice. "We're implementing your reform proposals," he announced. "But we need you to help train the next generation of judges. Your experience is invaluable." The request represented a unique opportunity to shape the future of the judiciary. She thought about all the young lawyers who had reached out to her over the past year, sharing their own experiences with bias and their dreams of creating change. Working late into the night, she began drafting a training program. It wasn't enough to teach laws and procedures, they needed to address the cultural issues that had allowed corruption to flourish. The program would include ethical decision-making, bias recognition, and the importance of moral courage. Her computer pinged with an email from a national judicial reform organization. They wanted to create a documentary about her investigation, using it to inspire similar efforts across the country. The story had resonated far beyond their state's borders. As she considered the request, her eyes fell on a framed photo on her desk, the task force team on the day they announced their first round of indictments. They looked tired but determined, united in their commitment to justice. Each person in that photo had risked their career to expose the truth. A text message arrived from one of the young attorneys who had faced discrimination in Judge Henderson's court. "Just won my first federal case," it read. "Couldn't have done it without the changes you started. The playing field is finally starting to level." Messages like these reminded her why their work mattered. It wasn't just about punishing corruption, it was about creating a system where justice truly was blind, where every person had a fair chance regardless of their background. Near midnight, she received one final call, from Judge Henderson himself. "I've been asked to speak at a judicial conference," he said. "To talk about how bias can corrupt even those who think they're doing right. Will you help me prepare my remarks?" The request symbolized how far they had come. A judge who had once embodied the system's problems was now working to prevent others from following the same path. It wasn't about redemption, it was about recognition and change. As she prepared to leave for the night, she noticed a small package on her desk. Inside was a gavel with an inscription: "Justice is not just what we do, but who we become in its pursuit." Tomorrow would bring new challenges. The federal investigation was just beginning, and there would be powerful resistance to change. But tonight, she could see the impact of their work, in the reformed state courts, in the young lawyers finding their voice, in the renewed faith in justice. The city lights twinkled below her office window, each one representing a story, a life touched by the legal system. Their work was far from over, but they had proved that change was possible. One person's stand for dignity had sparked a movement, and that movement was reshaping the very foundations of justice. 2 years had passed since that fateful day in Judge Henderson's courtroom. The young federal prosecutor stood at the podium of the National Judicial Conference, looking out at a sea of faces, judges, attorneys, and legal professionals from across the country. She had been invited to deliver the keynote address about transforming the justice system. "Change doesn't always announce itself with fanfare," she began, her voice steady and clear. "Sometimes it starts with a single moment of standing your ground, of refusing to accept what everyone else considers normal." The conference hall was packed, with attendees standing along the walls. Among them were familiar faces, members of her task force, reformed judges, whistleblowers who had risked everything to expose corruption. Each had played a part in the transformation of their state's legal system. During her speech, she shared not just the statistics, hundreds of cases reviewed, dozens of corrupt officials removed, new transparency laws enacted, but the human stories that had driven their work. She told them about the retired clerk who had documented years of injustice, the young attorneys who had faced discrimination, the defendants whose lives had been altered by biased rulings. "The hardest part wasn't exposing corruption," she explained. It was confronting how many people had convinced themselves that bias was normal, that injustice was inevitable. Change required not just new laws, but new ways of thinking. After her speech, a young law student approached her with tears in her eyes. "I almost quit law school last year," she confided. "I didn't think I could succeed in a system that seemed stacked against people like me. Your story gave me hope." The conference had brought together reform advocates from across the nation. Their state's investigation had sparked similar probes in 12 other jurisdictions, each uncovering its own networks of bias and corruption. A national movement for judicial accountability was growing. During a break between sessions, she received an urgent call from her office. The federal investigation they had launched was bearing fruit. 3 federal judges had just been indicted on corruption charges. The pattern they had exposed at the state level had indeed extended into the federal courts. Back in the conference hall, she participated in a panel discussion with other reformers. Judge Henderson was among them, now an advocate for judicial accountability. His transformation from symbol of bias to champion of reform had become part of their story's power. "I had to confront my own blindness," he admitted to the audience. "I thought I was upholding the law, when in fact I was undermining its very foundation. It took someone with courage to show me the truth about myself." The afternoon sessions focused on practical reforms, new systems for case assignment, artificial intelligence tools to detect patterns of bias, community oversight boards. Their state's reforms had become a model for others, proving that systematic change was possible. During these discussions, she received a message from the Attorney General's office. The president was establishing a national commission on judicial reform, and they wanted her to serve as one of its leaders. The work they had started in one state courthouse would now help shape federal policy. As the conference's final day drew to a close, she met with a group of state chief justices. They were implementing similar reforms in their own courts, creating a network of accountability that spanned the country. The justice system was slowly transforming from within. "The old guard is retiring," one Chief Justice observed. "The next generation of judges understands that accountability isn't a threat to judicial independence, it's essential to maintaining public trust." That evening, at a small dinner with reform advocates, she shared a table with the daughter of the retired clerk who had first exposed the corruption. The clerk had passed away, but her legacy lived on in the changes she had helped create. "My mother always said that justice isn't just a concept, it's the cumulative effect of thousands of individual choices," the daughter reflected. "Each time someone chooses to do what's right instead of what's easy, the system gets a little better." Late that night, in her hotel room, she reviewed messages from her team back home. The state legislature had just approved funding for a permanent judicial oversight committee. The reforms they had fought for were becoming institutionalized, harder to dismantle. Her phone buzzed with news alerts. Other states were passing similar reform measures. The movement was gaining momentum, spreading beyond their initial expectations. Real change was happening, not through dramatic gestures, but through persistent, systematic effort. She thought about that first confrontation in Judge Henderson's courtroom, how it had seemed like such a personal moment. She couldn't have imagined then how far the ripples would spread, how many lives would be touched by the changes that followed. The next morning, preparing to leave the conference, she received one final surprise. A group of law school deans had created a scholarship in her name, specifically for students committed to judicial reform and accountability. Her story would help inspire and support the next generation of advocates. As she packed her bags, she found a note that had been slipped under her door. It was from a judge she had never met, from a small court in a distant state. "Thank you," it read simply. "You've given us all the courage to look in the mirror and demand better of ourselves." On the flight home, she drafted an email to her team. The federal investigation was expanding, the reform movement was growing, and their work was far from over. But they had proved that change was possible, that the system could be made better, that justice could become more than just a word. Looking out the airplane window at the landscape below, she thought about all the courthouses down there, all the lives touched by the decisions made within them. Their work had started a transformation, but its ultimate success would depend on countless others choosing to carry it forward. The pilot announced their descent, and she could see her city spreading out below. Somewhere down there was the courthouse where it had all begun, where one person's refusal to accept injustice had sparked a movement for change. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new battles for justice. But today, she could see the fruits of their labor, in reformed courts, in renewed public trust, in young lawyers who no longer had to choose between their dignity and their careers. As the plane touched down, her phone lit up with messages from her team. They had new leads to follow, new reforms to implement, new battles to fight. The work would continue, but now they knew that change was possible. One courtroom at a time, one decision at a time, they were building a justice system worthy of its name. The sun was setting as she drove home from the airport, casting long shadows across the city. 2 years ago, she had stood alone in a courtroom, facing down bias and injustice. Now she stood at the heart of a national movement for reform, surrounded by allies and supporters who shared her vision of true justice. The story wasn't over, it was still being written, in courtrooms and law offices across the country. But they had proved that change was possible, that courage was contagious, that justice could be more than an ideal. And that was a story worth telling, worth fighting for, worth believing in.